Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. Patch 11.1 is bringing with it a ton of new class revamps, which we've been able to cover most of them on the channel, though not all, with only a handful of classes left over, Warrior being one of them. As all three specs are receiving a number of changes, some big and some small, though this is by no means a finalized set of changes, as it does seem like they got something big planned for Warriors with a huge damage shooting with a bunch of buffs all across the board, which they put up on PTR for a short bit of time, and then they removed it very quickly. So maybe the plan to push this for the next few weeks or something along those lines. Maybe Warriors have even more buffs coming in the future, but for now I did want to take a look at everything that we have so far for the spec of arms, fury, as well as protection, and take a bit of a deeper dive in at how this class is looking to evolve heading forward into Season 2 of the War Within expansion. As always, if you guys want to see more regular patch 11.1 PTR class updates and previews, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe, but otherwise, let's dive right in. I'm a little bit sad that I had to put Warrior towards the back of the line when it comes to taking a look at their 11.1 revamps, though I guess there is still one class outside of Warrior that hasn't gotten touched at all when it comes to 11.1, and that is my main, the class of Rogue, which is unfortunate, but Warrior is actually very fun, actually kind of surprisingly fun, especially with some of the new changes for Fury, which at first I thought I wasn't gonna like, but I think now that I got to really experience it and play it, I feel like they have quite a bit of potential. So Warrior's got some generalized changes, either when it comes to some of the talent changes, but also when it comes to some of the visual things, just very slight ones. Like Spell Reflection has a different animation. That shield icon, it's clean, it's very high quality, I like it. I wonder if they'll add a glyph so you can go back to the original version or use this new version, because there's some charm to the original version as well. But either way, it looks pretty and has a nice quality to it. As for the generalized Warrior talents, they wanted to do a bit of restructuring, specifically when it comes to Reinforced Blades talent. They were able to take one of the talents that Warriors don't normally get to pick up, which normally increases your stamina, and they baked it as part of Reinforced Blades. By also giving Reinforced Blades 2 points, you can now increase your stamina up to 10% more and your armor by up to 10% as well, which should give Warriors a little bit more baseline survivability. This also allows Warriors to play around potentially dropping a single point to put into things like Overwhelming Rage, which they've also adjusted this on apparently also 1 point cost that grants you 30 extra rage. You could use it for utility things like Bounding Strike, maybe when AoE Fear, maybe Hone Reflex for some cooldown reduction, maybe like Rumbling Earth, potentially things like Intravene. So it at least technically gives you like a choice node that you can move out for other things if you want more utility or if you're just looking for a little more survivability. They did, however, adjust the pre-capstone row of the Warrior talents, and those are a little bit different now. Right hand side, we have Armor to the Teeth, which grants you strength based on your armor still. Wild Strikes grants you haste, and auto attack crits increase your auto attack speed. Cruel Strike still increases your critical strike chance and the critical strike damage of execute. But now the weapon specialization for each single spec, Prot, Arms, and Fury, now has been moved. Instead of being below double time at a single point, now it's up to 2 points, and it sits on the left hand side as a gate to Thunderous Roar. So each and every single one of them is going to be about the same, where it's going to increase the weapon damage by 3% and 2% reduction from AoE effects for arms per point spent. For Fury, it's going to be also weapon damage 3%, but also 2% movement speed. And for Prot, it's going to be weapon damage as well as 2% leech that can stack up to 6% and 4%, which I think most Warriors right now are going down into Thunderous Roar as a playstyle choice because it seems to be fairly effective, at least as of this moment, but it is something that kind of adjusts the talents in terms of how you spend it. It looks like Warriors might actually start putting point out of Armor to the Teeth to pick up 2 of Wild Strikes, 2 of Cruel Strikes, and then 2 of Two-Handed Weapon, because that seems to be what a lot of players' builds are going into, unless you need something down below here for Avatar for whatever reason, like maybe as a Fury Warrior with the new Avatar talent that they have, or Avatar modifying talent. Besides this, they also increased the bleed damage from Thunderous Words by 2, actually it gets reduced in fact. So the damage increase from bleeds is increased to 20% instead of 30%. So a slight reduction within Thunderous Words. If you're not going for like a bleed heavy build, I guess you could take a point out of here and spend it somewhere else. Potentially, but it's just a little bit of them tuning when it comes to some of the generalized capstones. As for the spec of Arms Warrior, what they really wanted to do is make sure that abilities like Mortal Strike feel good to play every single time. So their theory now is to try to promote Cleave and Mortal Strike to be an ability you want to use as soon as it's off CD. Technically, you can modify and empower Mortal Strike with a variety of different bonuses, like your Overpower, which increases the damage of Mortal Strike and Cleave, normally by 30%. That value has been changed. There's a couple other talents like Execution's Precision buffs the damage or effectiveness of your Mortal Strike. So it's like a couple abilities that you can use to amp up the value of that Mortal Strike to be stronger. So in some cases, the warriors were kind of delaying it and looking for buff abilities before they send out a big Mortal Strike or a Cleave, and they kind of want to rework it so that you are encouraged to use those abilities on cooldown. So Mortal Strike buffed up by 15%, and so is Cleave, which is kind of huge. But the martial prowess, overpower, damage enhancement mechanic has been dropped from a 30% damage increase to a 15%. So they're transferring power out of martial prowess towards Mortal Strike, transferring power out of martial prowess towards Cleave to try to get you to use its abilities as soon as they're available, and then so you could use Overpower as that filler ability over being like a higher priority ability, which feels pretty good. I think it actually kind of works out for Arms Warrior. Just sending Mortal Strike and Cleave as soon as it's available does feel pretty nice, especially since those abilities can also be reset by a variety of different effects. Although the Arms Warrior tier set has been adjusted recently based on community feedback, their tier set for DPS warriors is Winning Streak. Your abilities have a chance to proc you an effective Winning Streak, which usually buffs the effectiveness of one of your basic abilities. For Arms Warrior, it is Overpower, which can hit up to 50% more damage, which makes it actually very, very strong in comparison to Mortal Strike, as it's just a primary ability, but it can hit pretty hard overall. Now, Overpower does have a 15% chance to end Winning Streak immediately, and when the Winning Streak does end, then you gain 2% haste, and your Mortal Strike and Cleave damage is increased by 2% per stack of Winning Streak. So if you had all 10 stacks, when it reset itself, then that's up to 20% more haste and 20% more damage in a Mortal Strike and Cleave, which is a fairly standard buff. As you can see, cashed in, haste does give you more resources. It allows you to use your abilities a little quicker. It gives you a little bit more rage generation, more auto attacks, but also gives you those chunky big Cleaves and Mortal Strikes. So it has a bit more of this consistent gameplay loop, and it still encourages you to press Overpower whenever it is available, but with the buffs to Mortal Strike as well as the buffs to Cleave, it should be a little bit of a higher ability priority, which should give you more opportunity to actually build those winning streaks instead of consuming them way too quickly. So if you should, hopefully, if you play very, very aggressively, should allow you to hopefully get a lot of benefits, some big bursty benefits out of winning streak instead of getting like only 2 stacks or 3 stacks at a time. But besides this, Arms Warrior doesn't really change too much. Where we do see some sizable changes is to the spec of Fury. They've changed the spec by quite a bit. So first things first, Avatar can have multiple different impacts, and I wanted to have Avatar a bit more of this gameplay element for Fury. Normally players play into Berserker's Tournament, where activating Avatar or Recklessness grants the other buff for 8 seconds, which means that you'll pop Avatar, pop Recklessness, both of those abilities are active for a good bit of time. So you're like in your peak burst phase that lasts as long as humanly possible. But alternatively, you can now go into Titan's Tournament, which is a lot different. While Avatar is active, Rampage's rage cost is reduced by 20, and Bloodthirst cooldown is reduced by 1.5 seconds, which allows you to spam rapid fire a bunch of Bloodthirst, hopefully into Rampages back to back. And with certain playstyles that will focus very much on the Bloodthirst ability, like empowering it as much as possible, or have Bloodthirst proc other effects such as Mounted Thing, which plays heavily into Bloodthirst, there's a little bit more of this bursty synergy now. However, burst cooldowns don't stop there for the spec of Fury, as this spec is getting juice on raw damage, as they're changing the way the Reckless ability works completely, modifying it where Recklessness immediately grants you a bunch of rage, and while Recklessness is active, you have access to Raging Blow and Bloodthirst at all, or rather you have Crushing Blow and Bloodbath, access to those at all times, replacing your Raging Blow and Bloodthirst. Your Crushing Blow has changed by quite a bit. Not only does it more physical damage, but Crushing Blow has a 25% chance to reset, that's not new, but it also has a 10% additional critical strike damage. So now you have this crit damage synergy. If you stack a bunch of crit and you go into a Raging Blow heavy build, then those Crushing Blows can deal 10% more critical strike damage. And that on its own can be quite potent. Bloodbath also got its own effect, does a lot more damage, restoring a little more health, but now Bloodbath causes the target to bleed for a certain amount of bleed damage over 6 seconds. Using Bloodbath on the target extends that bleed by the same amount of time, which technically means you could just extend this bleed into almost infinity. I'm actually going to go into the new Titan's Torment playstyle in order to use Bloodthirst as often as possible in order to kind of show you off just how strong this build is and how long this bleed lasts. But as long as I can just keep press Bloodthirst again and again, look at this: Rampage, Bloodthirst, Rampage, Bloodthirst, Rampage, Bloodthirst. I mean, it's just do button burst window if you're playing those two talents all together. And even if you don't, I mean, your Bloodthirst just keeps extending it. So now I've got a minute-long bleed. A minute-long bleed that actually does a decent bit of overall damage. So now if you wanted to, you could play Fury Warrior as a full bleed-based class, sorta, kinda. It's not an easy passive bleed or anything like that, but it is a fairly potent bleed that's just constantly active on the target. And technically, you could actually keep extending the bleed if you get lucky. That does mean you have to play Fury Warrior as like a casino build, but it can do pretty well. The change to Reckless Abandon actually impacts some of the talents below it by quite a bit. Depths of Insanity gives you a little bit longer duration on this bursty window, so it gives you a couple more globals of those bloodbaths and crushing blows. But also, Unbridled Ferocity. Rampage has a 6% chance to grant you Recklessness for 4 seconds, and if you get lucky enough and you get enough Rampages, that gives you that bloodbath back, and that bloodbath can then extend itself more. So if you get lucky enough, you could technically have that bloodbath last the entirety of an encounter. So that's about what looks like about 7%, or yeah, about 7% of just additional damage just from a bleed from pressing the ability of Bloodbath. That I did have to go into this whole Titan's Torment playstyle, however. So this is where I needed to get as many Bloodthirsts as possible because it has such short cooldown, but also got a bunch of Rampages in there back to back during that window, which all these things do a decent bit of overall damage. I don't know if that is the build you're gonna run. I think a lot of players are still picking up Berserker's Torment, but maybe there'll be some situations where you could run Titan's Torment together with this whole Reckless Abandon and then proc and Unbridled Ferocity to continue the bleed on and on and on. And that bleed can be buffed up by things like Bloodborne. Bleed damage of Odin's Fury, Thunderous Roar, Bloodbath, and Gushing Wound is increased by 20% with Bloodborne. You can further increase the effectiveness of Bloodbath with Vicious Contempt, where Bloodthirst will deal additional damage to enemies that are low health, which gives it a big execute window, sorta kinda. Although during that burst, especially if you're running together with Titan's Torment, I don't really find a lot of moments to press Rage and Blow, so maybe some of those Rage and Blow talents could potentially be put on a bit of a back burner. But the damage from your Unbridled, for example, like with your Ravager, it also counts towards the Bloodbaths as well, so that is something that could actually help extend the duration of those bleeds also. It's a very interesting combination and gives Fury Warrior a bleed build to some degree, which at least is what it feels like at first, but it's really just a burst damage build more than anything. It gives warriors now a much stronger burst window on a 1.5 minute cooldown, though at a cost of damage outside of major CDs. I think what they're really trying to do is they're really trying to make Anger Management and Reckless Abandon more competitive against each other. With Anger Management, you get more uptime of Bladestorm and Ravager and just more resources, but not as much of a big burst window. While the one for your Reckless Abandon to be this huge burst window that's highly impactful, but the damage outside of major cooldowns does seem to suffer by quite a bit. This changes the Fury Warrior where you no longer have this mini burst every time you hit a Rampage, and then you can go for a big Crushing Blow and a Bloodthirst, and then combine it together maybe like a big Odin's Fury, or maybe throw down a Ravager or anything like that. And now it seems like you'll have a 1.5 minute big window, and then you don't really do much damage outside of it. Make it Fury Warrior much more leaning into a burst-based class, rather than like burst-based class with quite a bit of sustain. But the burst is a lot more effective, as you can now machine gun a bunch of Bloodthirsts back to back to add a pretty sizable bleed damage. There's now also crit damage synergy together with this new version of Reckless Abandon, as well as Crushing Blows if that's how you choose to play it. New gameplay elements without necessarily complicating Fury Warrior's rotation, which is really good to see. But I think I am going to miss the original version of Reckless Abandon, how you can have those mini bursts in between of your basic combat rotations. To trade it off for a huge 1.5 minute cooldown may mean that Fury Warriors will have to be very, very cooldown sensitive in content like Mythic Plus dungeons, in raids. You'll have to really plan out when you want to use your major cooldowns so you can get the most amount of value out of those CDs You can't just send cooldowns whenever you want to anymore. As for the tier set, the Fury Warrior tier set I don't think changed too much this time around. Your 2 set is still going to be winning streak, just like Arms Warrior, which increases the damage of your Rampage by 2%, stacking up to 10 times. Rampage also has a 50% chance to end winning streak. When you gain the stack of winning streak, you have a chance to either cause your next Bloodthirst to deal 15% increased damage and have a 25% increased critical strike chance, or cause your next Rage and Blow to deal 15% increased damage and generate 2 additional rage. It's a tier set that is going to empower one or the other ability with additional effects, which may mean you may need recoils to track both of these bosses a little bit more, especially if you end up going for like a full-on bleed Bloodthirst Bloodbath build, where you want to primarily use Bloodthirst and Bloodbath as much as possible, not as much of Rage and Blow, but that extra damage and the extra rage generation from Rage and Blow will probably make it a little more consequential. But it seems to be like a very almost a random tier set that doesn't necessarily play in the same way as the others. Like most of them, whenever you lose a winning streak, you gain some kind of a guaranteed buff, which is how most classes are designed. For Fury Warrior is just a chance to gain random winning streak. Rampage has a chance to remove winning streak, and every time you gain a winning streak, you just have a random chance to gain either Bloodthirst or Rage and Blow. There's just so much randomness to it. I almost feel like they should change it so when you do consume winning streak, both Bloodthirst and Bloodbath are empowered, so you get a bit more of this guarantee out of both abilities, but just gotta having it be so tied to RNG. Not my favorite tier set if I had to go with it. And outside of this though, Prot Warrior is another spec that's going through a wild number of changes. While the talent tree doesn't really adjust too much, they're going through some really big, kind of on the back end, the engine behind the Prot Warrior changes. Basically, what they wanted to do is, they said in the blue post is, Prot Warriors currently are flooded with rage as a resource, and it undermines quote-unquote rotational defensive decision making and encourages them to constantly dump rage into ignore pain to maximize its effectiveness. They take it past reducing rage generation of Warrior by primarily adjusting their shield slam and how often it procs and resets to hopefully give them more breathing room to use other abilities and use the rage a little bit more carefully. Now, while technically Warriors can agree that, yeah, they do generate a lot of resources, at the same time, though, Blizzard does have a tendency when they try to really shift around resources when it comes to class abilities, it has a lot of cascading effects. Not only can it impact other things like cooldown reduction that may potentially play off of other resources, optimum of certain CDs, or even have a class just feel more sluggish than before, which are just not the way to go about it. If a class feels worse to play, doesn't feel quite as reactive or as engaging to play, even if your resources technically are fixed, is that actually making the class better? And that's where a lot of players are really trying to hit this whole set of changes from that type of an angle. It doesn't necessarily have the Warriors feel better, but the class in some cases actually does feel worse because of these changes. Like the actual resets for your shield slam with the strategist talent, that has been reduced from 30% chance to reset to 20%. Sounds like a penalty will no longer give you a extra rage generation by shield slam, but it just gives you still a reduction for cooldown per 6 seconds. Even talents like Blood Surge gives you supposed to be only 3 rage instead of 5 rage, but for some reason it's still doing 5 rage. Used to work off of all bleeds, now it's only for deep wounds instead, so things like Rend won't actually benefit it. The talent of Violent Outburst now stacks a little bit more granularly, like you can actually see it in your personal resource display as you are spending rage. It stacks up little by little, so it's a little bit easier to test or easier to track at the very least. It still is roughly the same as it was, though they did end up changing it so it no longer gives you as good of a shield slam resource generation when you do get to proc it, with the rage generation from this effect reduced by 50%. They did change the cooldown of shield wall to 3 minutes, which is very nice overall. And the ability of ignore pain, the actual value of it has been increased by 30%. The ability still does have a cap, but at least it is a little bit more effective as a mitigation tool for Prot Warriors overall. Outside of this, they also increased your ability damage by 5%, shield slam damage by 20%. They've also added so the brace for impact stacks 3 times instead of 5 times, but gains a lot more value with 10% shield slam damage, as well as 5% shield block value, which used to be 5% shield slam damage, 3% shield block value, so you're able to get a lot more of this value up front. Also, the talent of Punish is a little bit more effective. They increase the damage reduction of Shield Slam on targets from 2% to 4%, so it's a little bit more effective. And then talent of Instigate, it causes your Devastator to generate 2 rage instead of 1, which maybe they're trying to get them to switch from, hey, don't play Blood Surge, maybe play Instigate so you can get a little bit more passive resources. Maybe that's what they're going for, but who knows really. It's always going to be one of the situations where you essentially are trying to slow down a playstyle of a certain spec. And Prot Warrior and Warriors in general, like any kind of tanks in the game necessarily, a lot of them do enjoy to play it on the safer side when it comes to how the class is designed. Like, nobody really likes having a class that generates too many resources, because then it feels kind of like, you know, useless. Like if you have energy or focus, but none of those things are important, you can just ignore that bar. It's probably is better and healthy for the game so that those things are meaningful. But when it comes to warriors, when it comes to them trying to deal with the intake of damage, you are now impacting their survivability by impacting their rage in terms of the amount of resources they have in order to keep themselves afloat, because that rage generation does kind of hit up their ignore pain mechanic, as they're trying to give them more abilities to use in between. But a lot of the playstyle and satisfaction does come from those resets of the shield slam and being fueled by those resources. And this also doesn't cover things like your anger management based gameplay, since you are technically generating less shield slams. And yeah, no, warriors right now are kind of just having to dump a lot of the rage into ignore pain, but it does give them better anger management uptime because it reduces the cooldown of things like avatar as well as shield wall. But with you giving them less slams, you are reducing the anger management, the feel, the cooldowns, uptime. Just the entire playstyle overall feels a little more sluggish than players prefer. Some warriors are also worried that they're basically locked into playing thing permanently, that not enough changes are being done to Colossus to make it more viable, more of a valid option to pick up for Mythic Plus or raids or really anything. I think a PvP Colossus actually gets quite a bit of play, but outside of that, like most Warriors of Mountain thing, it's just been kind of locked in choice, and it looks like that'll be their locked in choice going forward into 11.1. Where other specs and classes are seeing enough changes where there might be some variety, there's seeing enough talent adjustments where there may be opportunity to explore other hero talents, the hero specs. But it looks like Warrior are walking into this this patch specifically, kind of just feeling the same, but just a little worse than before. Then there's also the resource generation for Violent Outbursts. You can kind of see how like there's just all these little, like, maybe they're nitpicky, but there are issues that end up cascading. It's a lot of small issues they become one big amorphous blob that now you have to deal with as a prot warrior. It's not ideal, it's not great. What a lot of warriors at the end of the day want is more variety when it comes to the talents, a little bit more options when it comes to the hero talents, and if they are going to be reducing their resources, potentially they could rework their basic gameplay loop with things like, I don't think necessarily shield block, I think that's fine. I think for the most part shield slam resets feel really good. What they could maybe do is adjust how much rage those shields resets maybe generate, maybe change the way that ignore pain works and how much rage it costs, and maybe make it more impactful. So overall, yeah, Prot Warrior definitely has a bit of concerns, but I am excited to see what kind of changes they'll have going forward. They have been very responsive to a lot of other classes in terms of the changes. Like, there's a little community feedback things like hunters no longer have to play with a pet, but they still want a pet, so they give them a talent where they can now play with a pet and they can still use it in open world content, maybe in dungeon content, while still retaining a lot of the utility. So if they're able to do little things for classes that are not going to be consequential or mandatory or a huge game changer when it comes to end game and overall meta play, if they can do that for hunters and mages and all those other classes, I'm sure they can figure out an answer for prot warriors and warriors in general heading into 11.1. But for now, though, that is going to be the entirety of everything when it comes to warrior for the patch 11.1. All the new stuff, all of the concerns, as well as potentially what they could do in order to make the spec play a little bit better. But as always though, I do want to thank all of you guys much for checking out this update for the patch 11.1. If you did enjoy this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community where we regularly discuss all of the new stuff happening on 11.1 PTR and post all of the newest class changes and little updates. Also, let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.